Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the new LEA Special Education Point of Contact Orientation. This is a part of our Summer 2021 Start of School Training Series. This presentation is brought to you in collaboration with several teams here at Aussie, the Division of Systems and Supports K-12, the Division of the Chief Information Officer, and the Division of Teaching and Learning. My name is Tiffany Ingram, and I will be kind of navigating the presentation today. I want to start off with our agenda for this morning. We have a very full agenda for you, and we will conclude at 10:30. We want to make sure that we do have time allotted for Q&A from our participants this morning, but this is our agenda. We're going to start out reviewing the role of what the special education, LEA special education POC is, and what kind of the expectations are around your role. We'll then transition into our SEDS administrative tasks, go through our OSSE support tool, which you will need to be very familiar with. And after those sessions, we'll stop, make a pause for a 5-minute Q&A. We will start back up and review our special education policies, IDA monitoring activities, our special education process, and a little more about working with non-public schools and providing SEDS access for those sites. And then we'll close out around 10:25 to allow questions from participants. As we go through the slides today, first I want to say that if you look in your GoToWebinar taskbar, you'll see handouts are already uploaded. There is a PDF version of this PowerPoint presentation for you to be able to download. At the conclusion of this presentation, we will be uploading that to our website as well for your review with the video and copy of the presentation. Throughout the presentation, you feel free to put any questions that you may have in the chat box for us, and we will make sure to get to them during our break time, or we may be able to even get to them during the presentation, but we want to ensure that all of your questions are answered. Again, you will have a copy of this PowerPoint presentation that also shares our contact information of the presenters today. So if you have any questions after the presentation, you will be able to follow up with the team here at Aussie. Starting the introduction around the role of the special education point of contact. So each LEA is required to have a special education point of contact at for their location. Oh, I want to make sure we are still showing the full presentation from current slide. Here we are. And you will serve as the Aussie point of contact, and your responsibilities remain largely the same year to year, and some modifications may change according to our state needs. In addition, we do put on a monthly special education webinar that will highlight any new or emerging information throughout the school year. So it is critical that you attend those sessions on a monthly basis. Our sessions for this school year will start in August, and you'll get additional information about that at the conclusion of the webinar. We have separated kind of the role of the LEA special education point of contact into 4 different buckets. So we would look for you to be acting as the LEA's liaison between your location in Aussie, just to ensure you have the most updated special education policy and guidance. Also, identify any key areas of need for technical assistance or professional development for your team. You would be the point of contact in our monitoring and compliance. You will act as the liaison between your LEA and Aussie to ensure any implementation documentation that needs to be provided to correct noncompliance. You will also sorry about that. You will also be the point of contact for evidence-based practices, around ensuring that your location is supporting and leveraging any OSSE resources on evidence-based practices and serving students with disabilities, sharing those opportunities with your staff, as well as being the data absence system kind of SEDS administrator on the behalf of your LEA staff, and you'll be accessing multiple systems here within OSSE for ensuring that you are accessing the student information and serve in a support role for your staff there. It is critical that you are assigned as the LEA special education point of contact in eSchool Plus, and this is critical for you to be able to receive information from the all teams here at OSSE and around special education needs. So ensure that if someone shared this information with you about being a part of this training, please ensure that you connect with your data manager at your LEA to make sure you are properly listed in eSchool Plus as the contact. Again, we will be looking for you to work collaboratively with several folks at your LEA around assessments, pre-K special education, early childhood transition, in particular LEA transportation, and your LEA data manager, as well as your English language learner coordinator, to ensure that all your teams are working together. You're sharing this information that you get from all of the webinars as well to ensure you all are best supported in a good position to support your students with disabilities. Again, I know that was a brief overview. However, we do have contact information from our LEAs here to share contact information from the OSSE team here that supports our LEAs in the variety of buckets we just described. So if you have any further questions in any of these areas, feel free to reach out to the team. And again, this presentation is downloadable in your handout section, so you will be able to save this for your reference in the future if you need to reach out to any of these team members. I will now turn it over to Rita to share about our SEDS system administrative tasks.
Awesome. Thank you, Tiffany. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rita Larkins, and I work with the Office of the CIO, and I'm going to be presenting today on the SEDS administrative task. Now, these administrative tasks are really the things that you as a SPED POC would need to do in order to prepare the system so that your users at the LEA are able to have a seamless transition into the new school year. So I'm going to be talking about transitioning the system to the new school year, the school system calendars and reporting periods. And then I'll talk about account management, what you need to do to ensure users have access to the system, and then also access to student records. So we'll talk about caseload setup and also getting support for any issues and problems that you may have while using SEDS. So let's get right into it. So let's start by talking about transitioning to the new school year. I mentioned that you are responsible for making sure the system is operating in the new school year. So that means you're going to want to check your school system calendar to make sure that we're actually in the right school year. So a couple of things that you'll need to do. You'll need to check the school system calendar, update the reporting periods, and that's for progress reports that happen in SEDS. And then also keep in mind that SEDS uses your primary LEA calendar from eSchool Plus. So you want to make sure your school calendars are updated in eSchool Plus so they reflect appropriately in SEDS. So step one of flipping your system to the new school year, you want to make sure that you go into the school year. So we'll start at the school system tab from that main menu. And then you'll go into editing the school years. So on the next screen, you're able to see the different school years that are already populated in your database. For most people, the last school year you should see is that 2021 school year, and then the general start and end dates for that school year. What we will do is add that next school year. If 21-22 does not appear, we'll simply click the Add Next School Year button. And on the next screen, you're able to enter the start and end dates. You don't have to worry about going in and filling out all the holidays and that kind of information. That information we will actually pull from eSchool Plus, but this is a SEDS requirement that you enter the start and end dates, okay? And then you'll click Update the Database. This is going to allow us to go ahead and flag or tag the dates for the 21-22 school year. And then in our next screen, when you enter the dates and edit that database, you are now able to go to the next screen, please. Select the 21-22 school year when you go edit the school system. Okay, so just a couple of steps that you'll need to take to make sure that we are in the right school year. So this screen is really just showing you where you're going to go select that next school year indicator, and then you'll update the database. So in our next screen, you'll see that we are now in that next school year. You see that it's populated. What we'll want to do next is update the reporting periods. So your reporting periods reflect when teachers are able to create progress reports in SEDS. Typically, this goes along with the reporting periods for the regular LEA. So you'll want to enter the reporting periods to allow teachers and providers to create those progress reports. So in the reporting periods column, we'll click on Edit. And in the next screen, this will allow you to enter the begin and end dates for your progress reporting periods. And you can also enter a due date. So the last date that your teachers are able to fill out that progress report information in the system. One thing you should note is that you should limit the number of actual reporting periods to 4 periods. When you exceed those number of periods, sometimes it can disrupt the way the progress report prints out. So we advise that you use 4 regular reporting periods and 1 ESY period. So when you get to ESY and you have to name that ESY period, it needs to be reported exactly as you see it on the screen, reporting ESY period number 5. All right, so after you have your school system flipped to the new school year, you have entered your progress reporting. Now you'll want to start working with your users. And as a start of school, part of your start of school checklist for SEDS, we always advise that you do a user audit. So as a SPED POC, you're responsible for protecting the privacy of student information, and that means who gets access in SEDS, right? You are really the gatekeeper of that for most of your users. So as a good task at the start of school year, housekeeping, you should include a SEDS user audit. You want to search for any users that are no longer at the LEA, users that no longer need access to a student file, and non-public users who no longer need access to a student's file. So that's what you'll want to do in your SEDS user audit. Search for those users that should be updated or removed from the system. In the next screen, as you go through auditing and taking a look at users that are already in the system, we strongly, can I say that again? We strongly advise you not to modify or change any of the state user accounts. So those are user accounts for OSSE level staff, and that allows us to best assist you when you call for SEDS support or information. So please do not modify any of those accounts that say state administrators or help desk accounts. Any of the other accounts, which are LEA level accounts, you should go through to make sure that those people are still with your LEA and they still require access. In the next screen, this is where you will be able to select users that you may need to inactivate. So one thing about SEDS is, although we're telling that you should delete inactive users, users are never actually deleted from the system. Their accounts simply become inactive. So if the person returns, you can always reactivate the account at a later time. So for any staff member that is no longer with your LEA, you'll select the delete in that delete column. Just put the check marks next to delete, and you'll click inactivate selected users. Okay, these people will now become inactive in your database, and in the next screen, you are able to go back and see any of those inactive users. So as I mentioned, inactive users are never deleted from the system. They're just inactive. They don't appear in your active list when you search for users. But you do have the ability to go back to your school system tab, to your inactive users, and this will allow you to reactivate a user in the database at any time. Next, I want to transition to start talking about access to student records. How do teachers and providers get their caseload assignments? Again, another of those responsibilities of you, the SPED POC, responsible for assigning caseloads for teachers and providers, removing users from caseloads that don't need access, and then also, importantly, ensuring access to non-public users. Now, before we dive into the Wizards tab, I just want to make one quick distinction here. I know you see a Caseload Setup wizard right above the highlighted Caseload Administration wizard. Caseload Setup wizard should be used for you, the special ed POC, to set up your own caseload. Typically what the SPED POC does, they would have a caseload which includes all SPED students in their building. You can decide that. But the Caseload Setup wizard allows you to set up your own caseload. Caseload Administration allows you to set up the caseload for other LEA staff members. In the next screen, after you select Caseload Setup Wizard, this will allow you to search for by first or last name. You can search for any user or groups of users. You can search for SPED teachers, right, that you want to set up the caseload for. So you'll select that user. You can enter their first or last name and click View User. In our next screen, this will allow you to select that user for caseload setup. Now, when you select the user, you're going to already see the number of students that are currently on their caseload, if they are a case manager, or if they are a team member. And you can go ahead and select that name. So we'll select that name, click the hyperlink to that name, and in the next screen, this will allow us to add or remove students from that user's caseload. So a couple of buttons that you have available for you when you're doing caseload administration. So you can remove all students from an individual's caseload and just add whatever students they're going to have this year. Their caseload could have completely changed from the previous year. So in instances like that, you may want to remove all the students and just start adding new students this year. You can also transfer or copy a current caseload from one user to another user, and I'll show you that in just a moment. In the next screen, now that we see what student a team member already has, we can select whether that person is going to be their case manager or a team member. You're just checking the box. And then when we add that student, it will allow us to add more students or find more students to add to the person's caseload. You can go to the next screen. I'm sorry, go back one. My apologies. Okay, so now you've added the student, you see the student is added to the caseload, and you'll just repeat that to add all of the students that are slated to go to a particular user's caseload or a team member. I did mention that you can copy caseloads over to other users. So if you have one teacher that had a certain set of students this year and a different teacher is replacing that person, you can actually copy that whole caseload over to the next person. All right, so that is caseload administration. Really quick, but I do have some other materials I'm going to offer you a little later on in the presentation today. Next, I want to talk about what you need to do to get support if you run into problems, issues while using SEDS. So that is our OSSE support tool, OST. And that's where you can go and create tickets for different issues that you are experiencing in the system and allow our data liaisons or one of our other subject matter experts to assist you with your issue. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about OST. Now, I know that I'm talking about OST in the context of help for SEDS, but you can really use the OST for a number of data issues. And you'll hear that a lot when you start talking to the data liaisons and your data manager. When there are certain issues, they will tell you to make sure that you have entered your issue in the OST. So the purpose of this OSSE support tool is really to give you all, the LEAs, a vehicle to contact the state for support and assistance. And this tool actually tracks your issue, tracks the responses, if it's being investigated or if it has been resolved. So only the LEA SPED POC and the data manager have access to the OST. Typically, we do not take tickets from teachers and other staff at the LEA. You are the first point of contact for those individuals. If they are experiencing an issue with the system that you can't resolve, that is where you will go and enter an OSSE support tool ticket. And then you'll get assistance from people like me or other folks on my team to help you with that issue. So the LEA POC is responsible for providing a solution for your staff members. But again, if it's something you can't solve, you would put this OST ticket in. And in the next screen, once you get access, you'll request, add a request for support. You can also request for student records transfers, and you can review the different requests that you have entered. So it is a tracking system, so you'll know what you have out there, like what open tickets you have and what responses you have received from the OSSE team. In our next screen, we do have a transfer of records process. Now, the records transfer process happens along with enrollment. So when there's a stage 5 enrollment, upon the first day of attendance, OSSE will initiate a records transfer. And those are records that you're going to see in SEDS. So the stage 4 enrollments, again, it's registered when the student is registered in SIS. This is the process by which OSSE will start that records transfer. A lot of this happens automatically between systems. You don't need to actually send in a request. In the event your records do not transfer, that's where you can go into our OSSE support tool and request records transfer. Next screen. Okay, so you can review any outstanding requests. And again, this process is only gonna really be relevant if it doesn't automatically transfer. You'll be able to make a transfer in the system. And you may have one-off situations, but pretty much the records transfer along with the enrollment status of the student. Next slide. Okay, So I'm going to pause at this time. I don't know if there are any questions in the chat box. Tiffany, are we taking live questions or chat questions? Okay, so at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Tiffany. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat box and I can respond to your questions.
Hey Rita, before you jump off, I do see one question in the chat, in the questions box, asking how do we access the OST site?
The OSSE support tool site. So after you have completed SLED training and you are listed as the SPED POC in eSchool Plus, your data liaison can request access to OST for you. I hope that answers that question.
Great, thank you, Rita.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is Christy Weaver-Harris. I'm the Policy Manager in OSSE's Division of K-12 Systems and Supports in the Office of Special Education. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the policy and guidance that's available from OSSE that governs the education of students with disabilities in the district. Next slide, please. So just to give you a quick overview, governing special education law is both federal law and regulations. The federal law is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and at the local level, there are DC laws that are found in the DC Code, and those laws are set by the DC Council. And then there are also local regulations, DC regulations, that are set by OSSE, and that is generally referred to as Chapter 30. And those are drafted and proposed by my team. There's also local policies and guidance available. So you'll find the most detailed description of special education requirements in local policy. And we're working on updating the special education regulations now and anticipate an opportunity for public comment on those proposed regulations in the next couple of weeks. Next slide, please. All right, this is what our special education policy landing page on our website looks like. So we have like 16 policies here. This is, like I said, this is just what you'll see on our website. As you can see, we have a lot of policies that cover a lot of topics. So I encourage you to refer to that site often when you are looking for guidance on what the expectations are programmatically. And this is our local guidance landing site. Again, we have some guidance here. This is non-regulatory guidance. So this is just explaining what the requirements are. This is helping to provide further guidance to help explain what the requirements are. It does not create new requirements, but it does help explain what is expected. You can see we also have some other resources down here, like Dear Colleague letters that we have issued in the past around discrete areas of law, generally related to the transition of students from Part C to Part B. And at the very bottom, you'll see that we have something called Special Education Policy Bulletins. So this is a new activity that we've undertaken where we issue a guidance document. It's a narrative guidance document that provides guidance on a very narrow area of law or expectations to provide clarity to LEAs and to educators around what their obligations are. So as you can see in the last couple of months, we've released 3 policy bulletins. One of them is related to medical assessments as part of an initial evaluation or a reevaluation. The second is eligibility criteria for visual impairment, which is also being updated in SEDS this weekend. And then the final is ESY, is related to ESY services. So I encourage you to refer to these 2 sites pretty often. OSSE does communicate about policy and guidance updates both through the LEA Look Forward and through the Special Education Point of Contact webinar. So as long as you are plugged into those resources, you should be fairly aware of what is happening. But these are going to be your go-to areas for information on what your obligations are. Next slide, please. All right, so this is C2b Transition is a area of high visibility in the district, and if your LEA serves 3- and 4-year-olds, it's important to know that under IDEA, your LEA is responsible for ensuring a smooth and effective transition of students from early intervention services to LEA-based IEP services. And this includes participating in transition planning conferences when you receive a transition conference invitation, determining eligibility and developing an IEP by the child's 3rd birthday, and implementing that IEP by the child's 3rd birthday. DC is currently subject to a class action lawsuit called DL-v-DC, and we have a lot of information on our website about the very specific obligations that district LEAs have under that lawsuit. We also have some additional resources on that site, and we talk about this frequently. So keep an eye out and be plugged in. If you ever have questions about your obligations related to C2b Transition, you can reach out to me directly or to Dawn Hilton. Next slide, please. So LEAs are, as part of your obligation to implement the child's IEP by the 3rd birthday, LEAs are required to document the first provision of specialized instruction for children under the age of 6 who have specialized instruction prescribed on their IEP, but who have not previously received it. So if it's a student's first IEP, you must document the first provision of specialized instruction. If it is their first IEP where they are changing from a speech-only IEP to an IEP that has services and specialized instruction that is not specifically speech, you also must document that. So you're responsible for documenting this for students that are at or around the age of 3 who are transitioning from Part C, who are at or around the age of 4, who are transitioning from an extended IFSP, so again, from early intervention services, and students ages 3 through 5 who are newly determined eligible for special education, including children who are transferring from out of state. So any student between the ages of 3 and 5 who has a new IEP or who is newly determined eligible and has their first IEP or their first provision of specialized instruction, you're required to document that first provision. We're going to have some trainings on this coming up. There's also some resources on our website related to this too. Next slide, please. So you are not required to document specialized instruction on an ongoing basis or for all students. It's only the student populations that I just spoke to. You are not required to document it for a student whose IEP has been revised or amended if the student previously received specialized instruction under the prior IEP. You are not required to document it on like an annual basis for children younger than 6 who are continuing within your LEA that have a current eligibility or who have transferred from another LEA who have a current eligibility and who have previously received specialized instruction. So again, there's a bunch of resources related to this on our website. I do encourage you to look at our Dear Colleague letter regarding these obligations, and there's a training on our website about this. And I will speak a little bit more about some resources that we have too. Next slide, please. So in July of last year, OSSE issued a consolidated and comprehensive guidebook for the start of the 2020-21 school year, containing guidance on LEA responsibilities under IDEA Part B that related to the provision of FAPE, while LEAs were required to close their doors or limit access to buildings because of the COVID-19 public health emergency. So this was really to govern or to help LEAs understand their obligations while we had transitioned to distance or blended learning models. So previously issued guidance, we had issued a bunch of guidance between like March and July of that year. All of that was consolidated and organized to be consistent with like the special education process. We updated that guidance a number of times throughout the school year to address new issues or frequently asked questions that we had received, such as completing initial evaluations, child find obligations, remote service provision, and most recently in June, we updated it to address accelerated learning for students with disabilities. So I encourage you to review this guidance to better understand what your obligations may be under remote and blended learning, but also keep an eye out for updated guidance that is more related to the context of returning to in-person instruction. So this guidance will be helpful if you are providing remote services for a student who has either been excluded from education or has a medical exemption, but for the return to in-person instruction, we will be issuing updated guidance. Next slide, please. Something else that I wanted to make you aware of is that we have a collection of recorded webinars that are from quite a few years ago, but the policies have not changed since then, that cover a wide variety of special education topics. And it goes through the basic requirements of the topic, like the laws and regulations that are related to it, best practices and implementing those requirements, and then how to document those actions in SEDS. So it really goes through kind of the what is required and how you do it. And you can find it on our Policy to Practice webinar series. These, like I said, these are a little older, but they can be a good jumping off point when you are trying to find some information on what might be expected of you. Next slide, please. And finally, here's a bunch of resources. These are links in the PDF if you want to download that so that you can just click right in. These are the relevant resources for special education policy, including our policies, our guidance. The third bullet down where it says OSSE Child Find, Initial Evaluation, and Early Childhood Transition Resources is where you will find all of our resources related to C2b Transition and the DL lawsuit. This also has a link to our last year's COVID-19 guidance. We have some resources related to placement oversight, which Katie will get to in a minute, some of our non-public monitoring resources, and finally, a link to our monthly LEA Special Education Point of Contact webinar, which Tiffany spoke about before, and you will also be hearing from her about moving forward. If you ever have any questions about special education policy, you can please feel free to reach out to me directly or to my team at ossie.dsepolicy@dc.gov.
Okay, good morning, everybody. This is Karen Morgan Donaldson, and I am the manager of our IDEA Part B Monitoring and Compliance team. And I will be providing an overview of what monitoring and compliance looks like in DC. So if we could go to our next slide, please. So these are just this is a quick snapshot of what you need to know related to your role, specifically with IDEA Part B monitoring. Each LEA is assigned an IDEA monitor that provides support and technical assistance throughout the school year, and also conducts quarterly and annual monitoring activities. The goal of OSSE's monitoring and compliance system is to ensure of all federal and local regulations, which Christy just spoke about. Some of the monitoring activities may include database reviews, coordinated on-site compliance monitoring, records reviews, and then LEA self-assessments. So next slide, please. So under IDEA, each state education agency is required to implement what's called a general supervision system that monitors the implementation of IDEA Part B and any accompanying regulations. So as OSSE is the state agency for DC, we are responsible for oversight requirements. There are 3 overarching monitoring activities or requirements that OSSE is responsible for. They include making annual determinations about the performance of each LEA's implementation of IDEA. You can think about annual determinations kind of like an LEA's annual report card around special education. The second overarching monitoring activity is OSSE is responsible for enforcing compliance with IDEA Part B through various monitoring activities, some of which I spoke about in the previous slide, around specific IDEA regulations. And then we are also required to report annually on the state's performance and each LEA's performance to the Department of Education through what's called the Annual Performance Report, or we also refer to more commonly as the APR. So basically the primary focus of OSSE and our monitoring activities is on improving educational results and functional outcomes for all students with disabilities in the district, and also to ensure that LEAs meet the program requirements under IDEA Part B. Next slide, please. This gives you an idea of all of our monitoring activities. We monitor for different reasons, and I'm just going to go through the reporting and the monitoring activities and how they correlate. So DC is under specific conditions for its IDEA grant. So we are required to report separately to the Department of Education on secondary transition requirements and whether or not we are meeting those, and then reevaluation timeliness rates. So that is what we refer to as specific conditions, because we are required to report to the Department of Ed on those separately. We also, Respace Monitoring is an annual type of monitoring that high-risk LEAs are monitored for LEA level indicators and also student level indicators. So this can be in the form of on-site monitoring or desktop student file review monitoring. It can also be in the form of just technical assistance. We also conduct complaint-driven monitoring. We sometimes receive complaints, and my team will sometimes, if it doesn't fall under a state complaint or other avenue, sometimes we will do investigative complaint-driven monitoring. We also monitor for all APR indicators. These include initial evaluation timeliness with a focus on 3 to 5-year-olds, C2b monitoring, secondary transition requirements, and then significant discrepancy and disproportionate representation. We also conduct child find reviews. This is also with a focus on 3 to 5-year-olds. And then we are also required to identify LEAs that have a significant disproportionality. So this is an overview of all of our monitoring activities in which we conduct throughout the school year, or the calendar year, I should say. So what are LEA's requirements related to this? LEAs are required to follow federal, state, and local guidelines, IDEA, DCMR, required to identify a SPED POC and eSchool Plus, which Tiffany talked about earlier in the presentation. This is really important to ensure that all OSSE communications get to the correct person. The SPED POC must do 3 specific things, and that is attend a special education webinar, the monthly webinar, attend a SEDS training, and then also sign up to receive a DC CATS login. Some best practices that we suggest LEAs participate in teaching and learning trainings throughout the school year. Okay, so DC CATS is the system that we use, the District of Columbia Corrective Action Tracking System, and it is a web-based tracking system that we use to keep track of IDEA monitoring and compliance and findings that are issued. Next slide. So as I stated, each SPED POC is required to have a DC CATS account. This slide gives you information on how to request that account. It also gives you information on how you can request account for another staff member at your LEA and what to do if you forget your password. There is a link on this slide that you can use to request an account. We do ask that you allow 48 hours for your account to be activated. You can also access this link on the DC CATS resource page. Next slide. In your LEA are to identify a SPED POC, attend a SEDS training, and then request DC CATS access, and then please update your eSchool Plus with the appropriate SPED POC contact information. Again, I want to stress how important that is. It's imperative for us to make sure that everybody receives the information that we're distributing to LEAs. And our next slide is resources. There are 3 links here to OSSE SPED guidance documents, laws and regulations, and then of course a link to our SPED monthly webinar series. These are recordings from previous presentations and webinars, and every monthly webinar is posted on this website after it occurs. If you have any questions related to IDEA monitoring and compliance, feel free to reach out to me directly. I believe my contact information is later in the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen. We are now going to transition into the special education placement oversight process, and I'll turn it over to Katie Rita.
Thanks, Tiffany. So I'm Katie Rita. I'm the Special Programs Manager at OSSE, and I oversee OSSE's placement oversight process. So placement oversight really has to specifically do with a student's least restrictive environment and where their placement is across educational environments. So if an LEA or an IEP team, parents are a part of an IEP team, don't forget that, believes that a student might require placement in a more restrictive environment, such as a non-public day school or residential, must seek a change in placement from OSSE. To initiate that review, you would send an email to my attention with a justification for a removal statement. And from that point on, OSSE conducts our placement review process. We meet with members of your school team, related service providers, social workers, of course, special education teachers, other administrators, staff who are important for us to speak with, and we look to see, what interventions have you put in place? What steps have you taken to ensure that a student is only moving on the continuum in the most appropriate way, and that you are maintaining the spirit of IDEA, which is to keep students with their non-disabled peers as much as possible. We speak to the parent, and if it's appropriate, sometimes we'll speak to the student themselves. In previous school years, we've done student observations, and once it is safe for OSSE to re-engage in those students' observations, it'll be something that we will certainly move back towards once it's appropriate and safe for all parties. Part of our review process ends in what we call a change in placement meeting, where OSSE provides recommendation and technical assistance to the team. OSSE is not a decision maker when it comes to determining a student's placement. We play an advisory role, but we hope that the team takes into consideration the information, technical assistance, and insight that my team provides as we do a placement review. And then lastly, just part of my team's role at OSSE is to implement the district's policies and procedures regarding placement review, regarding LRE, making sure that students are, as I said before, educated under the spirit of the law, which is to be as educated with their non-disabled peers as much as possible. And then as a reminder, once a student is placed into a non-public setting, the LEA still remains responsible for that student and their progress in the provision of FAPE. Next slide. So this kind of is a quick graphic for you to kind of expect what happens when you submit a placement review. The review will come to my attention. It'll be assigned to one of the change in placement coordinators on my team. We have at minimum 30 days to complete a review. However, as long as all parties are willing to move forward and schedule, we generally can complete our reviews fairly quickly. You'll get emails from the case coordinator asking you for documentation, proposing meeting dates to meet. We'll always do an initial call with just the LEA team. And then, as I said before, we'll reach out to the parent and anybody else that's appropriate for us to speak with. We'll have a change in placement meeting. We'll continue to do those virtually for the start of this upcoming school year, and LEAs will be notified if we go back to meeting for those meetings in person, but they'll continue to be virtually for the start of this school year. That's when we'll issue our recommendation, and the team will make a determination on whether or not the student does need placement in a more restrictive environment, or whether they can continue to be served within the LEA with additional supports and services. If the team does move forward with a change in placement to a non-public setting, that's when OSSE's location assignment phase begins, and we work to identify a school location. So just some key reminders for you guys thinking about this moving forward. Remember that students with disabilities are entitled to a free public education in their least restrictive environment. So you should be looking at what your continuum is, right? Obviously, the spirit of the law is that students should be included with their non-disabled peers as much as possible, but that doesn't stop LEAs from ensuring that you have a full continuum. So if students do need to be removed from their non-disabled peers, that you have the full array of options afforded to students under the law, including things like resource rooms or self-contained classrooms. It's important to remember that special education is not a place, it is a set of services and supports. So looking at what sort of additional accommodations, modifications, intervention your LEA can provide to be able to keep that student in a lesser restrictive environment. Things that you should be considering is that placement should be determined at least annually, should be based on the student's IEP, meaning we should not be looking to change students' placements based off of administrative reasons, lack of resources, lack of staffing, lack of a space within your LEA. It should be solely based off of what does this student need in order to gain access to the gen ed curriculum. I know this is a lot of information. All resources regarding the placement process are online. That includes an LRE webinar, includes the policy that Christy spoke about, an FAQ, a parent brochure, as well as my contact information. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if you're unsure of whether or not your team should be moving forward with submitting a request. Myself and my team are always willing to be thought partners and provide LEAs as much technical assistance to ensure that we're making data-driven decisions for kids.
Thank you so much, Katie. We will now transition chatting with Sharon to share a little bit more about working with non-public schools and what those LEA roles and responsibilities are. Sharon?
Thanks, Tiffany. Good morning, everyone. This is Sharon Powell with the Nonpublic Monitoring Team, which falls under the Office of Special Populations and Programs and within the Division of Systems and Supports K through 12. In this part of the next slide, please. In this part of the presentation, we'd like to remind any LEA that has a student or students placed in a non-public special education school or program that the LEA remains responsible for ensuring compliance with IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and the provision of FAPE, free and appropriate public education. In order to ensure that LEAs are complying with federal regulations, OSSE conducts student file reviews on an annual basis and issues findings to the LEA if non-compliance is identified. Please note that placement of a student in a non-public school does not terminate or suspend a student's enrollment in your LEA, and LEA should be in direct and regular communication with your points of contacts at the non-public school and reviewing progress reports and other data so that your LEA is well positioned to actively and meaningfully participate in IEP team meetings and discussions around the continued appropriateness of the student's placement in what is a more restrictive environment, as well as the timing of the student's transition back to a less restrictive environment as soon as that becomes appropriate. Next slide, please. Regarding LEA non-public, next slide, please. Yes. So let's see. So in order to ensure that LEAs are complying with our local and federal laws, OSSE also conducts in-person on-site monitoring visits to all OSSE approved non-public schools that serve DC students, and interviews students and staff while on-site to ensure compliance with our local DC regulations that govern the operation of non-public schools. Next slide, please. Regarding LEA and non-public school roles and responsibilities and the delineation between the two, the regulations do not always explicitly state which party is responsible for doing what. When we look at the main responsibilities, they typically break down like this in practice. The LEA, as mentioned, is responsible for progress monitoring and addressing and correcting any findings of noncompliance. The LEA is also responsible for attendance intervention planning in accordance with the provisions of Chapter 21 of the DCMR under Title 5, Section A. Please note that non-public schools are not only required to enter student attendance into SEDS, the special education attendance tracker, which LEAs have access to through SLEDs, but they're also required to notify LEAs when a student has accrued a certain number of unexcused absences. So the non-public school provides a flag to the LEA so that you, the LEA, can initiate attendance and truancy protocols when appropriate and required. The LEA is also responsible for conducting reevaluations unless the LEA has an agreement with the non-public school and for the non-public school to conduct or to administer and arrange assessments to determine continued eligibility for special education and related services. Here in this second column, the non-public school, as mentioned, is responsible for providing direct services such as related services and documenting the provision of those services. The non-public school is also responsible for producing progress reports on at least a quarterly basis. In terms of reporting requirements, the non-public school is responsible for reporting attendance, as mentioned, as well as any incidents that involve the use of an emergency behavioral intervention, such as a physical restraint or seclusion, any incident that results in injury, all cases of suspected child abuse or neglect, and any incidents that involve an emergency response, such as a fire. Next slide, please. In order to ensure that roles and responsibilities are clear and understood by the LEA and the non-public school from the outset, we encourage LEAs and non-public schools to engage in a discussion about your respective roles and responsibilities, to come to an agreement and to capture that agreement in writing in the form of an MOA, a Memorandum of Agreement. For more information about the creation of MOAs, that can be found on the OSSE website as well as at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. And let's see. And yes, and a last quick note about data. The LEA is responsible for ensuring that all data required by OSSE is entered into SEDS and that it's accurate and up to date. Please pay particular attention to the students attending school in SEDS and that it accurately reflects the student's non-public school placement. If the student is not associated with the non-public school in SEDS and this non-public school, the non-public school and the non-public school providers will not be able to access the student's record and will not be able to complete, for example, service trackers in SEDS. Okay, I think that's it. That's about it from the non-public monitoring team for now. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, please reach out to me or Dr. Stewart or Tony Lemons and LaShonda Wilson, the non-public team monitors.
Thank you so much, Sharon. We're going to transition in now to chatting a little bit more about that SEDS access for non-public schools, which you briefly touched on. And I know that Rita will be able to review some of the information in terms of enrollment and how that looks in terms of SEDS access for our non-public staff.
Oh yeah, Tiffany, absolutely. Let me go ahead and talk through that. Thanks for having me back. I'm just going to talk a little bit about how the non-public schools are actually gaining access, not just to SEDS, but also to your individual student records for students that are enrolled at a LEA. So I'm just gonna kind of walk through the workflow of what you're seeing on your screen. And we're gonna start with just our student A, who's enrolled at LEA number 1. And then we also have a student B that's from LEA number 2. And they're both attending that same non-public program. So we're just gonna talk about how access is given. Now, the non-public staff members are going to need access to student A and B in SEDS, right? They're both attending that same non-public. And they're making their request to their non-public SEDS POC. There is a SEDS POC for each non-public school. And that person works similarly to the SPED POC at your local school or at your LEA level. So the non-public SPED POC is going to use the OST. They already have access in the OST, and they will request an aggregate account for their non-public staff members. Now, let me just quickly explain if you're not familiar. An aggregate account gives a user access to multiple LEA sites or LEA databases within SEDS. So you can log in one time and you're able to access LEA 1 and LEA 2. That is an aggregate account. You'll find that many providers that service multiple LEAs have aggregate accounts and many of the non-publics for the same reason. So that non-public POC makes that request for the aggregate account. And then OSSE creates aggregate accounts for those non-public staff members. The account that OSSE will create for the non-public staff members is going to include access to LEA 1 and LEA 2, okay? So now the OSSE is going to share those login credentials with that non-public POC. And the non-public POC is, of course, going to share that information with their staff members. Now, the non-public POC is going to contact LEA 1 and then LEA 2, and they're going to go in, like I demonstrated earlier in today's training, they're going to go in and give those non-public members, staff members, access to the students who are enrolled at their LEA who attend that non-public program. That means the LEA POC is going to go and add that non-public staff member to the caseload for that non-public staff member. Next slide. So those steps look just like as we're laying out. The non-public staff member is going to need access to student A and SEDS, and they make that request to the SPED POC, to the non-public SEDS POC, who reaches out to the LEA POC. The LEA POC is going to go through the following steps to grant access. So OSSE has actually just given the non-public staff person access to the LEA. You have to give them access to the selected school. So you should not give them access to your entire LEA. You should only give them access to the non-public school within your LEA. The LEA POC is associating the non-public user with the specific non-public school within SEDS, okay? And then you can confirm the user type, whether they're going to be a teacher or a service provider, and then all of the appropriate designations for related service providers under the can provide. You know, can they provide a educational assessment or different screenings that are available. You'll see that on the list. So they're checking off whether they can provide those services. And then the LEA POC at LEA 1 is going to contact that non-public POC to let them know that those steps have been completed in SEDS. Now, once those steps have been completed by the LEA POC at LEA 1 and 2, the LEA POC at the non-public can now assign students to their staff's caseload. And that is really the process that we'll go through to ensure that our non-publics have timely access to student records. Thank you, Tiffany.
Thank you so much, Rita. I know there may be some questions about anything from the non-public placement process, as well as any SEDS access questions in regards to non-public access. Feel free to put those questions in the chat. I would ask the team, maybe Christy, if you can see any questions that we may have missed from earlier. That may be good information to share, even if you've been able to answer that question, maybe for the group.
Sure. We had a question asking, I posted to the whole group so that you guys could see it. But yeah, to clarify, we are anticipating issuing new guidance around obligations once we return to in-person instruction. And I know that that's like helpful to know that it's coming, but not helpful to not have it yet. So if you have any questions about your obligations in the meantime, again, please feel free to reach out to me directly. Happy to provide whatever guidance I can. There were a few questions about how can you see student records prior to the first day of school? And as you know, the complicated process of turning over student information systems and turning over state level systems to the new school year, I do encourage you to use the Early Access for Students with Disabilities app in Click. Again, if you have access, you have to have the right level of access based on your role at your LEA, but we also have some more information on that on our Start of School website. And if you have any questions about the Early Access app, you can feel free to email me directly also. Let's see. To access the OST site, that's on octo.quickbase.com, but I don't really see, oh, there was a question about documenting the first provision of specialized instruction. You are only required to do that for students under the age of 6, so through the age of 5. You're not required to document the first provision of specialized instruction for any children older than 6. And for that, for children ages 3 through 5 or up to 6, it's only the first provision of specialized instruction. Those are the only questions that I'm really seeing. If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to put them in the questions box or in the chat box, and we'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Christy. In terms of well, and Rita, the teams will be provided with information when the migration has happened to view the new school year, correct? If they have the correct permissions in eSchool Plus, will they receive some type of notification about that?
About flipping the school year?
When students will be seen in SEDS?
No, they won't receive a notification about that.
Okay.
So once they are moved into the, actually Aussie is started into the new school year, started on Monday, but most people have not flipped their systems over to the next school year. So they will still be seeing right now 2021 information, I believe in SEDS. Once they move their system over to 2022, they will see updated information, but they, as Christy said, they can use the Students with Disabilities app.
Most definitely. And that will only be provided to folks who have the correct access in eSchool Plus. So it is critical that all your information in the correct positions are updated by your data manager, so you can ensure access to the proper databases to complete access that information. We are here.
Non-public question in the chat about placement that I can address real quick that has to do with transition from non-public schools.
Sure.
Yeah, so parents are welcome to request IEP meetings regarding possibly transitioning students back from a non-public school into the LEA. OSSE is not a participant in those meetings for those step downs back into an LEA setting. Obviously, as with everything, it's an IEP team decision. And so if you know a parent is asking to have a meeting to talk about a student coming back to attending a public setting, then you're welcome to have that meeting, but that's not necessarily a foregone conclusion with decision making. Obviously, you need to look at data and talk with relevant members of the team to make that determination. One thing that we remind LEAs is changing LEAs doesn't change IEPs. So you might have students that are transitioning into your LEA at different times in the school year, or at the beginning of the school year, and making those requests. You, as I said before, it doesn't change the student's IEP. The IEP still requires placement in a non-public day school setting. Then the ability to change that setting is done through an IEP team meeting. I think there was a question in there about meeting with DCPS. Obviously, if parents want to request an offer of FATE from DCPS, they're welcome to do so. But if they are enrolled in your LEA, then DCPS would not be a party to any change in placement meetings or any IEP meetings, unless the parent is looking to make that transition. And Irene, if you have further questions or it gets more complicated, feel free to reach out to me directly. But I think it's important for you guys to remind parents, especially as new coordinators at the start of the school year, that just because you enroll from one LEA to another, it doesn't mean that the child's placement then changes. Placement is determined and noted in the IEP. Only an IEP team meeting can, or a placement meeting can make that change happen. And so I encourage you not to just bring kids in. Okay, and I said it's the student is coming from DCPS. So you're welcome to speak with DCPS to talk to them about sort of the data sharing. But again, it would be a decision that the new IEP team would make if it's appropriate to step the student down.
Thank you for that clarity, Katie. Any other questions? I'm having a hard time seeing all of the questions in the chat box. I want to make sure we have everyone's questions answered as thoroughly as possible. I think we just answered that one. Team, if you're not seeing...
Yeah, I don't see any more questions in the chat, so we'll do a last call for questions. Either drop them in the questions box or in the chat. I'm monitoring both just to make sure that we catch it. But if nobody has any other questions, we can give people some time back if you would like.
Yes, most definitely. Again, the handouts, you can download a copy of this presentation in the handouts tab here and then go to webinar taskbar. And you will see a copy of the recording posted to our website. That is which we shared throughout this presentation. It will live on our webinar page as well as in the Start of Schools homepage that you'll be able to refer to throughout the school year. If you need anyone's contact information or you have additional staff members that are not yet onboarded that will need this information as well, feel free to share that. We thank you so much for joining us this morning. And again, reach out if you have any additional questions or concerns, but we look forward to you having an amazing start of the school year. Have a great rest of the day.